Good afternoon, and welcome to the continuing adventure of the CUNY Accessibility Conference. Folks are filing in from the waiting room, so we're just waiting until the participants' number stops moving, and then we will begin. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Optimizing Accessibility in the Digital Learning Environment. I'm Christopher Lydon from the CUNY School of Professional Studies, and I'm very happy to be moderating this panel with three colleagues from CUNY, the State University of New York, who will be talking today about their LMS transition and system-wide EIT policy. Before we launch into that, there is some housekeeping. So I will both read a statement on that and also pop it in the chat. Before we get started, I'd like you to know that this session will be recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, you may keep your camera off and your microphone off, which is the default setting for this webinar. You may also change your name if you do not want your current name visible in the live transcript. Live transcription is available for this session. You may turn on captions by selecting Show Captions at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you do not see this option, select More or stretch your window wider. American Sign Language interpreting is available for this session. Similar to captions, you may view the interpreters by selecting Interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom window. The presenters will take questions about 10 to 15 minutes before the end of the session, sometime around 3:45. If you please enter your questions in the Q&A. The chat will not be closely monitored for questions, so the Q&A is the place to do that. If you require video to sign your question or microphone access to voice your question, please use the raise your hand reaction so that we can update your Zoom settings during the Q&A. We will let you know when it is time to speak or sign. If you would like to share relevant resources or links with others, you may submit that information into the chat. And lastly, if you're experiencing any technical issues, please message the hosts in the chat so our tech support team can do their best to assist you. All right, and as I said, I will put that text into the chat. And with all of that, I would now like to briefly reintroduce this session, which is Optimizing Accessibility in the Digital Learning Environment. The speakers today will be Mark Greenfield from the University at Buffalo, Lauren Rodriguez from the SUNY system, and also Kim Scalzo from SUNY System Administration. And I'm turning it over to you, Kim. Thanks again for coming, and take it away.
Thank you very much for having us today. We're really thrilled to be able to join you here at your conference on accessibility. We are having our Student Success Conference at SUNY this week. And so we did a version of this presentation yesterday. And again, we're really glad to be able to join you all to do this session here today. I'd like to just do a check to make sure you're seeing the right presentation slide. Could Lauren or Mark, am I showing the right one? Okay, excellent. Great. So as you've heard already, our session is Optimizing Accessibility in the Digital Learning Environment. To just say a little bit more about who we are, I am the Interim Senior Associate Provost for Digital Innovation and Academic Services at SUNY. And I'm here today in my role really as co-lead for our Digital Learning Environment project, which is our implementation of Brightspace across the system. With me today is Mark Greenfield, who is serving as our EIT accessibility consultant for the SUNY DLE project here at the system level. As you just heard, Mark is formerly the EIT accessibility officer from the University at Buffalo and has really a wealth of experience in this area, as you will hear when we get to his section of the presentation. I'm also really happy to be here with Dr. Lauren Rodriguez, who is the Director of Resources for Students with Disabilities out of our Student Success division here at the system office. And Lauren comes from one of our campuses, Purchase, and has been working in this space as well for a while, and will be able to talk with you about how all of this plays out in relationship to the folks who work in the disability services area. So what I want to just start with is setting a little bit of context. So as I mentioned, I'm the co-lead for the SUNY Digital Learning Environment Project, which is our implementation of Brightspace across the system. And we decided to take a very intentional approach to this project, specifically that it is not just an LMS migration, but the development of a comprehensive digital learning environment across the system. And this is our goal statement that we've shared from the very beginning of the project in terms of what we're trying to do. And what I want to call out are a couple of pieces that I think are relevant for this session. First of all is that the LMS serves as the foundation for the digital learning environment and provides a wealth of opportunities for the integration of tools that can be used with the LMS at both the system and the campus level. And as you'll hear as we go through the session, it's a very significant part of our project and the way that we're thinking about what we're doing. We are also taking an approach to standardize the environment and to align wherever we can with existing academic and IT policies at the SUNY level. I'll point to that again in a moment. We are also trying to think about how we can minimize redundancy of tools and reduce licensing costs. And so it is really in that integration of the tools piece that we're going to, that we have really tried to identify some of the issues with EIT accessibility. So what does that mean? What does this transition and this transformation mean for us? So this is a kind of a visual of what the landscape kind of looked like before we started this project. And we had several different LMSs that were in play across SUNY, all as single instances. And so even though you'll see a lot of Blackboard on there, there were individual campuses had their own instances. So Blackboard from one campus to the other didn't necessarily look the same. So really every campus having their own environment to a single instance multi-tenant environment that is a shared environment for all of our campuses, really enabling students to be able to traverse the system as they go from campus to campus or as they enroll in courses from more than one campus at the same time. And just to give you a sense of some of the scope and the scale, we have multiple cohorts that we are implementing throughout this project. Today, we have 3 cohorts in play using the digital learning environment. So we have over 346,000 user accounts in the system. About 299,000 of those are students and 46,000 of those are campus faculty and staff. To date, we have migrated 71,000 courses 71,000 courses migrated with content from other LMSs to the new environment. In total, we have 276,000 total courses today. So it's been a pretty significant effort and a lot of activity. And the idea is to, again, have this intentionally designed system where faculty and students have a better user experience and we accomplish all of the goals that we identified in that original slide. This is the structure that we set out initially to support the project implementation. And I won't talk through this in detail, but I show this because there are particular groups and teams with specific charges, and you see them on the screen. And if you want to learn more about who all the groups are, you can see the link there. But the areas in green are teams that have campus representation on them, because we know that is an important piece of this project. The impact at the campus level is significant, and we wanted to make sure their voice was present in the project implementation. what I wanted to, the reason I showed that previous screen is because I wanted to show you that the groups on the left, the Academic Policy and Standards Work Group, Technology, Architecture, and Security Work Group, started out the very beginning identifying SUNY level policy standards and guidance that we wanted to align with in this project. And so the list of those policy standards and guidance are in the center there. And that has informed the work of the 4 groups that you see off to the right. Not surprisingly, one of those is EIT accessibility and universal design for learning. So that was front and center, one of the very first things that we talked about in this project. And we know that we have a tremendous opportunity as faculty are migrating their courses from one LMS to another to really look at how those courses are designed, the materials that they're using, and how well they enable and comply with EIT accessibility requirements. So where that has come into play initially, where it came into play initially was with our template creation work group and the training resources work group. So in the templates, we've created 6 templates that have been delivered and deployed across the system for faculty to use in creating their courses. And those templates are built with EIT accessibility kind of baked into them. Similarly, the training resources work group, who created all the materials that are being used for training, included training with content around EIT accessibility and universal design for learning. In fact, that was a required, universal design for learning was a required component of the training. And we had a whole separate project on that, which Lauren was involved in to ensure that, that we provided that for all the faculty going through our training. In terms of integration of tools, I mentioned that it's an integration of a suite of tools with the LMS. And as we got into this, we came up against several challenges. So the first thing was that initially, and this was in the first round, we had more than 140 unique tools that were requested by our campuses. We established a central process for the intake of those requests because we're doing the integration of those tools here at the system level. And in SUNY, the responsibility for ensuring compliance with EIT accessibility is at the campus level. So part of that intake process meant they had to provide us what their process was and what the documents were that they had collected from vendors to demonstrate EIT accessibility. What we saw was a great degree of variance from campus to campus. And so what we got was not complete enough for us to conduct the reviews. So this raised several questions for us in terms of how do we ensure that tools are being reviewed and comply with our requirements. One of our big questions was how to avoid duplication of effort for tools where we needed to go back and collect some documentation, or we wanted to make sure that we didn't have multiple campuses doing the same work. We wanted to think about how we could support campuses to get the reviews done quickly and efficiently, how to build campus capability to do this work going forward. And in particular, if a review had been done somewhere already in the system, how could we know that and be able to leverage it? And then finally, how would we sustain this work over time? So these were all the questions that came up as we encountered these challenges. And so going back to our structure, we've added a couple of teams since the beginning, and one of those was our EIT accessibility and security compliance team, because all of the issues that I'm talking about around EIT accessibility apply to security as well. You're all, I'm sure, hearing about the cybersecurity issues and how important that is on all of our campuses now. Okay, so we created this separate work group, and this is on the left-hand side, you'll see there are several work streams to this group that we brought together, and these are the things that they're working on. So the first is defining requirements for conducting the reviews. And so that has mostly been complete. Once we have the criteria, then we could establish the process to review the tool. So we're actually doing the review now here at the system level. So we needed a process for that. We also, in the process of doing this, going back to the concept of how do we not duplicate effort, we came up with this concept of trusted sources, which Mark is going to come back to and talk a little bit more about, and something we'd actually love to talk with you all at CUNY about. Once we are reviewing the tools and making decisions on them, we are creating a repository and a set of dashboards that provide visibility to our campuses for which tools have been requested, where are they in the process, which ones are implemented, etc. We also talked a lot about establishing a community of practice, not just with our own institutions, but with others at D2L, who is the vendor for Brightspace, and also for other institutions outside of SUNY and vendors who are providing other tools. So we'll talk more about that as well. Part of our work stream was, as I said, to conduct the tools for each tenant and campus that is in our shared environment. Professional development was another thing that we heard loud and clear from our campuses that they wanted help with to build capability at the campus level. So we are developing some training materials, and Mark will talk about that as well. And then finally, we see that in the end, there will likely be campuses who can take this work on themselves very easily, but there will probably be some who will continue to need help with this. And so we will be likely standing up a shared service for our campuses to support them beyond the initial implementation of the DLE. So these are the 7 work streams that we have outlined for the project and that we are working on. We needed to augment our staff to be able to do this, and we've engaged volunteers at the campus level to help us with this. Mark is serving as our EIT accessibility consultant because we are currently without an EIT accessibility officer. We brought on a project manager to help us with this whole work stream. We are using our own DLE administration team here at the system level. We have a student assistant who is helping us to do some of the reviews. We tapped into some existing Tableau expertise here at the system level to create those dashboards. We brought in our Office of General Counsel to talk about the ways in which we're approaching this from a risk management perspective to make sure that they are comfortable. And we have leveraged a campus EIT accessibility officer to be part of our team. And in the reviews, we are tapping into multiple campus level subject matter experts on the particular tools that are being reviewed, because they know actually how they're being used on campus more than those of us who sit at the system office. So that's the team and the staff that we brought on for support. So that's where I'll end. And at this point, I'm happy to turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of those work streams and what we're actually doing.
Thank you, Kim. Let me just get this slideshow going. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be back presenting at the CUNY Accessibility Conference. I spoke here a couple of years ago and made some great friends and professional colleagues. Before I get into talking specifically about the DLE project, I do want to talk about the challenges of accessible procurement and why procurement matters. In my opinion, and I've been doing this work for 20 plus years, procurement is the single biggest challenge when it comes to implementing digital accessibility in higher education. There are a number of reasons for that. The main one being a lack of resources and expertise to fully address the procurement that happens on a college campus. As you know, early on, we mentioned that I was the web accessibility officer at the University of Buffalo, and we purchase thousands of EIT products per year. In fact, we don't really have a firm knowledge of that number because a lot of those purchases happen at the department level with no involvement of the central procurement office. So when you look at just the scope and volume of this activity, it is really difficult to keep up with. The other thing to keep in mind when it comes to procurement is that the majority of our essential program service and activities are now provided on third-party platforms. And I think this trend is going to continue. This language, and I'll read this, people with disabilities must not be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or otherwise subjected to discrimination in any programs, services, and activities. That is a language that you will find in most complaint letters and complaints, through the Office of Civil Rights. I see this language in a lot of higher education, web and digital accessibility policies. So the reason I bring this up is I want you to think about the really important activities that happen on a college campus online. So whether you're talking about registering for classes, paying your bill, taking your courses in an LMS, dealing with the alumni office, on and on that list goes, and almost all of it now happens on third-party platforms. So I think it is really important to think about how do we make sure that those platforms are accessible. And it kind of gets into why when I was asked to be a part of the DLE project, I welcomed the opportunity because it's really, really important. And with the numbers that Kim shared previously, this is impacting a lot of students in New York State. So one of the challenges, even if you are thinking about procurement and is that it's important, is that the digital learning environment is often a low priority. In my role as an EIT accessibility officer, there were 5 areas of responsibility. I was responsible for making sure our websites were accessible. All of our documents, whether it's publicly facing or in the LMS, responsible for that as well. Procurement's a piece of that, classrooms, libraries, very large set of responsibilities, and procurement often is something that we didn't spend a lot of time looking at. And part of that was looking at this work through the lens of legal risk. Traditionally, the Office of Civil Rights focused their attention on public-facing websites. They did not look behind the firewall. That being said, I am hearing over the last year or two that the OCR is now looking behind the firewall, so that may not be quite, there may be more risk there than a lot of people appreciate. But traditionally, we didn't spend a lot of time looking things that were behind the firewall. Another challenge in the DLE is that faculty like to do their own thing. They find tools that they like, they find textbooks that they like. We have experienced faculty using a lot of free software. And again, when I worked at the University of Buffalo, it was a large research institution with 13 separate schools, and we didn't have a good handle on what faculty were actually doing within the LMS. Many of these tools, as I mentioned, were free or operate on a freemium model. And what I mean by that is that there's a free version of it with basic functionality, and then there's a paid version that gives you a little bit more functionality. And I always am careful, and I think you should be as well, in terms of using the word purchasing versus procurement, because a lot of the tools that we use are procured, but they're not purchased. There's no purchase involved. And that's one of the things I've had a lot of conversations with our office, our purchasing office, that we need to be thinking about procurement, including things that are free of charge. The other thing with the DLE environment is that many of these tools are difficult to test. And I'll get into this in a little bit more detail later, but it does take a lot of effort just to set up a testing environment. And that's something that I was a little surprised with as I got into this, but now fully appreciate just how complex these tools are and the environment is. So let me now get specifically into the work we've been doing in the CUNY DLE. And let me start off by saying that we are using Brightspace. I was on the team, the RFP team, that was involved with selecting Brightspace, and Brightspace is very accessible. It is one of the most accessible products that I have seen, and I have looked at hundreds, if not thousands of products. So when the decision was made by CUNY to use Brightspace as our LMS, as an accessibility advocate, I was very happy with that decision. So much of the work, most of the work I'm doing is actually in the tools that Kim had mentioned, looking at the tools that we're integrating into this environment. Right now, we are in the range of 185 to 200 tools. A lot depends on how you're defining a unique tool. In reality, I am probably going to be looking at 400 to 500 VPATs, or have to do testing, and I'll get into that kind of methodology in a second. So it is a big, big project. So within CUNY, we do have a policy on accessibility, and we have a set of recommendations. That is the basis for the work that we're doing. The CUNY policy and even the process that we're using for procurement is based on those CUNY policy and recommendations. One of the things I do want to specify is that our philosophical approach is to identify barriers. It is not necessarily to evaluate a product against the WCAG standards. And there is a difference in that philosophy. And I'll get into this a little bit more when I talk about our rating scale. But philosophically, we want to identify barriers. It is possible to have something that fully meets WCAG standards, but still has barriers. And the reverse of that is true as well. There may be things that don't fully meet WCAG standards, yet really don't present that much of a barrier. So it's a little bit different approach to testing and evaluating, to look at it through the lens of barriers rather than evaluating specific to the WCAG standards. And I will talk about that more in a second. We are currently in a 12 to 18-month project where we are doing this centrally, as Kim had mentioned. And our hope is once we have this initial lift done, that we will operationalize this by creating a shared service and giving campuses the option to either do this work themselves or be part of this shared service. So this diagram is an outline of the process we are using for the review of those 200 plus tools. The first step is determining integration, how this integrates with Brightspace. The second step is intake, where we are collecting documentation and identifying the functionality of a specific tool. Once that is done, we move to step 3 and we go through the evaluation process. And depending on whether the tool was approved or denied, we move to step 4, which is the exception request process. We do have a process in place that allows our campuses to use tools that don't meet accessibility requirements. One of the dirty little secrets around accessibility is that very few tools fully meet accessibility standards. And it is something, if you're new to this and kind of first exposed to this, even from a legal perspective, is, how can it be that we're using tools that aren't accessible? Why aren't they accessible? The reality is that's kind of where we are in 2023. Most of the tools that I've looked at, and again, I've looked at thousands of tools in VPATs. The vast majority of those don't meet accessibility standards. Doesn't mean that we're not going to allow them to get used, but we need to kind of go through a process to understand why we're using these tools and how we're going to provide accommodation. So what I want to do now is spend about 10 minutes going through this process in more detail. Let me just get a quick drink of water. So the first step, as I mentioned, was determining integration. And we have 3 levels of integration into Brightspace. And the way to think about this is through the, looking at the Brightspace interface. Does the Brightspace interface change when this tool is being utilized? There are a number of tools where, yes, there is integration, but everything happens behind the scene. There is no change to the Brightspace interface. And for this initial phase of the project, that is out of scope and will not be reviewed for accessibility. We will circle back and look at the tools, after this first phase is done. But in the initial phase, we're looking strictly at what happens inside of the Brightspace interface. The next level of integration is limited integration, limited functionality. The tool is available, the Brightspace interface does change, but it's a relatively limited change. The full tool is not available within Brightspace. Typically, this is because we're using that integration to allow for single sign-on, or we're just deep linking into the tool. You're not seeing the entire interface for that tool. So that's a limited integration. The third is full integration. The entire tool is available through the Brightspace interface. And we're taking a little bit of a different approach depending on whether it's limited or full. one of the things that we realized fairly early on is that the Accessibility Conformance Report, which is the completed VPAT, in many cases is not applicable to this work because it is for the entire tool. It is not for integration into an LMS. There are some companies that have produced ACRs specific to that integration, and in that case, we can use the ACR. But other than that, we're going to have to evaluate this differently. And again, I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a second. So those are the integration categories that we've identified. The next step is to do what we're calling intake. We need to gather the appropriate documentation, and that documentation typically includes the VPAT or ACR as a starting point. And we're also starting to use the HECVAT. And I want to talk about both of those in a little bit more detail. My guess is that most of you are familiar with VPAT. That is an acronym for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. It is the industry standard for reporting conformance to accessibility standards. Currently, there are 4 different versions of the second generation of the VPAT. There are differences between those 4 versions. And I want to point out one difference in particular. Most companies will either use the WCAG version of the VPAT, or they will use the Section 508 version of the VPAT. They are different. The Section 508 version contains a chapter, I think it's called Chapter 3, which is functional accessibility. What it does is ask very specifically, does your product work for people who are blind, people with low vision, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people who have manual dexterity issues, and people who have cognitive issues. And they ask you specifically, does the product support those audiences, those groups or not? And I find that information very valuable, especially when you're thinking about this within the lens of barriers. So if it was up to me, I would ask that everybody complete a Section 508 version of the VPAT. However, that is unrealistic because many of these are multinational companies. There is an international version of the VPAT, which is the one most of the international companies produce. But in a perfect world, I would love to see, in fact, I've talked to the folks who create the VPAT to say, you know what, maybe you should be thinking about including some of the things that are exclusive to the Section 508 version and include that in all the versions of the VPAT. The other thing I do want to mention is that the VPAT is the template. The completed VPAT is known as an ACR, an Accessibility Conformance Report. I am going to probably use ACR more often than VPAT, but I find myself using those terms interchangeably because most people have heard of VPATs and very few people have heard of ACRs. So I always struggle with, should I call it a VPAT? Should I call it an ACR? But just so you know what that difference is, again, that ACR is the completed VPAT. I want to spend a couple minutes talking about the HECVAT. That stands for the Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Toolkit, developed by EDUCAUSE. It is a questionnaire framework designed for higher education to measure vendor risk. Traditionally, it focused exclusively on security. But in the 2021 update to the HECVAT, questions were added related to accessibility. And again, I find those questions to be a great companion to the VPAT because it's asking vendors, how do you approach accessibility? How do you train your staff? What standards do you use? And lots of really good questions around kind of how committed is a vendor to accessibility. And I find that a valuable set of information. So back to the intake piece, we talked about gathering the documentation. The second piece that we want to do is identify top tasks and user flows for all of the user groups. You know, our focus is on students primarily, faculty as well, but we also want to understand how do administrators use these tools as well. And this is a mistake that I see a lot of people in the accessibility evaluation field make, is they look at a website or a particular tool and try to evaluate either the entire thing or only small pieces of it, when in my humble opinion, you should really be looking at this through the lens of what is somebody trying to accomplish on a given website or using a particular tool. If you're interested in this topic, there is a great book written by Jerry McGovern called Top Tasks. In the spirit of transparency, I have worked with Jerry in the past. I was a partner with Jerry, and I actually am a huge advocate for this approach to the web and this approach to accessibility, because people come to your website or they're using a tool in the LMS to accomplish very specific things. And when you're thinking about testing in the context of barriers, you want to know if somebody's trying to complete a task, are they going to encounter barriers along the entire path of completing that task? So for example, an entire tool could be perfectly accessible with the exception of logging in to actually get it started, where that piece of it could be, you know, something that's inaccessible. And if that's a barrier, it doesn't matter if everything else is perfectly accessible, that task now is inaccessible. And that's kind of the way that we frame the testing that we do as part of this project. So once we have that in place, we move on to the third step, which is evaluating the tool. If the ACR is something that we feel is accurate, objective, and complete, we will use the ACR as the basis for our testing. And this is something that I was pleasantly surprised with as I started working on this project. Traditionally, most ACRs are a work of fiction. I have no confidence that the people filling them out, A, knew what they were doing, or B, were accurately representing the issues that there may be in a particular tool. I have found in this project, many of the vendors are creating trustworthy ACRs. So I'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes. If we determine that the ACR is untrustworthy, we are going to do our own testing. And the evaluation that we're doing is based on the CUNY Web Accessibility Standards. And the other thing you should be aware of is that we are doing a fairly high level review. We are not going in and testing what I would call a complete full test just because of the resources needed to do that level of testing. I am typically spending probably 3 to 4 hours of testing, and I can find 90 to 95% of the issues. That grows exponentially, that time commitment grows exponentially, where you're going to spend 50 hours plus if you're trying to identify all potential issues within our given product. And it just is not something that we are, we're resourced to do. So we're doing these high level reviews. This is the rating scale that we have developed, and I've been using this scale in my work for many, many years. Rather than looking at something as a yes, no, it's accessible or it's not, we have developed this scale with 1 being the worst and 5 being the best. If something is rated a 1, it has serious accessibility issues that are a complete barrier for individuals with disabilities. The tool cannot be used. A 2 is that there are significant accessibility issues. The site can be used or the tool can be used, but it is really hard to do. A 3 is something where there are moderate accessibility issues. It doesn't meet kind of the letter of the standards, but the barriers are really marginal. An example of this I use all the time, it has to do with color contrast. The color contrast, the contrast between text and the background color by rule has to be 4.5 to 1. The UV blue we had at the University of Buffalo was 4.45 to 1. Did it meet the standard? No, it did not. Could my eyes see the difference between those two shades of blue? No, I couldn't. So even though it technically met the standard or did not meet the standard, the impact was marginal. So that's a 3. A 4 is it meets our accessibility standards. And a 5 is it goes above and beyond our standards. So for example, rather than just looking at WCAG AA standards, maybe the company is actually going to AAA. Maybe they're doing things above and beyond the standards at all. So those are the way we rate the tools on this scale of 1 to 5. So if we're going back and now scoring the tool, anything that is a 4 or a 5, the tool is approved. Anything that is a 1, 2, or 3 does not meet our accessibility standards and must go through the exception request process. So let me talk a little bit about that exception request. This language is right from the CUNY policy, which says there may be instances where procuring accessible products and services is extremely difficult. Exceptions may be granted in specific instances where compliance is not possible or would constitute undue administrative or financial burden. The reality is most of our tools are going to have to go through this process because they do not meet even our web accessibility standards. So the way this process works is there are 2 components we are looking for as somebody requests an exception to the CUNY policy. The first is the business justification. Why are we using a tool that does not meet accessibility standards? And there are legitimate reasons why we use these tools. It may be that the tool has a specific functionality that no other tool provides. It may be cost. Another tool costs 10 times as much as this tool, so we need to buy the one that's less expensive. So we need to see the business justification, and then the second piece are details on how equally effective alternate access will be provided. And this is where the accommodation piece comes in. If you're going to use a tool that does not meet accessibility standards, the expectation is you're going to proactively make available accommodations. So that's what goes into the exception request process. And again, most of the tools are going to go through that process. As I mentioned, I have been involved with accessible procurement for many, many years. I have looked at hundreds, if not thousands of tools. And one of the things that struck me very early in the DLE project was the difference between general procurement and DLE procurement. I just want to go over kind of these differences real quickly. In general procurement, the first step in most processes is to determine impact. And the reason that campuses do that really is a way to control the volume. Campuses cannot review thousands and thousands of tools in any given year. So what they do is determine impact, and things that are low impact, either because it's really a small number of people using the tool or it's not mission critical, they will not do any kind of testing or evaluation around accessibility if it's low impact. But with the DLE project and DLE procurement, we consider everything high impact because it's being used by students to take classes. So by default, it's high impact and will be reviewed. With general procurement, there is a real wide range of EIT. So we're talking websites, we're talking apps, we're talking computer hardware, we're talking kiosks, printers, on and on it goes. It's really a wide range of possible tools, where in the DLE, it's a much narrower range. Generally, there are a wide range of vendors and products, where in the DLE space, most of these vendors are very large established companies. I've dealt with vendors that it's a 2-person development shop, and they have never heard of accessibility before. Where in the DLE space, most of our vendors do understand accessibility and they are committed to accessibility, which has been, again, a pleasant surprise for me. As I mentioned before, in general, I have found most ACRs are a work of fiction, but in this project, many, I'm not sure I'm going to quite say the majority, but close to the majority of the ACRs are accurate and trustworthy. they have been completed by outside accessibility experts, or some of the largest companies do have that expertise internally, and they have provided the ACR in a way that is trustworthy. And then, as I mentioned before, in general procurement, accessibility testing is usually pretty straightforward, but in the DLE environment, we need to be able to set up views as a student. So if I want to do testing, and again, I'm not affiliated with a campus anymore. So if I want to do testing, I got to find a campus within the SUNY environment using a particular tool. Then I have to be registered in that class as a student and or faculty. And then doing all of that actually can get complex. And then doing the testing itself can get fairly complex, which is why I am happy to see that we're going to be able to move through this quicker than expected, because we can rely on the ACRs. And then the final thing I want to mention is that academic freedom in the DLE space is a big, big issue. I would never want to tell a faculty member what textbook they can use or what learning materials they can use. So we need to be aware of some of those academic freedom questions and work with faculty around the kind of balance between academic freedom and compliance to the law. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. So let me just kind of go back to talking about accessible procurement in higher education again. This has been a passion of mine for the last 4 or 5 years. I have talked with a number of organizations, including the Office of Civil Rights, the EDUCAUSE, AHEAD, Athens, CAST, the list goes on and on about the challenges of making these tools that we buy accessible. And there are 2 main issues that we come across. The first is, think about the terrible inefficiency when you have 4,500 institutions of higher education across the United States all doing the same work. Terribly inefficient, excuse me. There's got to be a better way to do that, especially because money is tight and there are fiscal constraints to being able to do this work. So there would be benefit if we somehow could share the work that we're doing. The second is that individually campuses don't have the leverage to put pressure on their products, on vendors, to make their products more accessible. I am finding in the work I've been doing with SUNY, we can put more pressure on vendors as a system within SUNY in 64 campuses using a tool rather than an individual campus. So hoping to address both of these issues. And one of the ways to do this is through a shared service. And Kim talked about a little about this at the beginning, where we want to be able to share our evaluations across all of SUNY. And what this will allow us to do is leverage the relatively scarce accessibility expertise, especially on smaller campuses. The smaller campuses within the SUNY system don't have the resources to hire, somebody who has that skill set and is working exclusively on the accessibility skill set. So this allows smaller campuses to kind of take advantage of the expertise throughout the system. To make this work, we are looking at coming up with a consistent methodology and a consistent way to interpret the standards. So we're starting looking at a shared service that will be a pilot for the DLE and then expanded for all of SUNY. Part of this is creating 2 courses in Brightspace to help with professional development. The first course will be how to test for accessibility, what the actual process is. And then the second set of courses will be on the procurement process. We are using DeQ University as the foundation for this training. SUNY does have a contract with DeQ. All SUNY staff, faculty, and students have access to DeQ University. We currently have over 6,000 people using that platform, and I'm a big advocate for that platform. That's the foundation for the training. And then what I'm doing is, once people have taken those foundational courses within DeQ, I'm now showing them how to test based on our methodology. And we're looking at 2 levels of materials in terms of assessment. We want to make sure people have a basic understanding, but we also want to go a little bit deeper to provide a credential for people who want to be a trusted source. So in order to be a trusted source, we at SUNY need to be confident that the people doing this work have the expertise and experience to do it correctly. So one of these courses we're building out in turn, we're going to evaluate it in such a way that we are confident that somebody who has completed this does know what they're doing. So let me wrap this up real quick. I know we're running a little bit short on time. Some of the challenges with trusted sources is, how do we vet to make sure that somebody does know what they're doing? Again, coming up with a consistent methodology and interpretation of standards. We're starting within the CUNY system. We do have some people, especially at our university centers, who have the skill set to do this work. We are hoping that after we do some training, there'll be other people within CUNY who can do this. Then beyond CUNY, hopefully we can start to leverage some other people. And I think the CUNY folks might be a nice way to start. And we'll talk about that at the end in the question period. You know, really looking to how we can expand these trusted sources. So let me wrap this up real quick. In terms of recommendations, I always tell campuses, if you care about the student experience, you should be making accessibility within your digital learning environment a priority. Second, you need to be pragmatic. There is a desire to be perfect, and sometimes perfect is the enemy of the good. You know, in a perfect world, I would probably do much more in-depth testing on all of these tools, but the reality is there are several hundred tools that need to be evaluated, and let's be pragmatic about how we take that approach. It is important to involve legal counsel. We want to make sure that the approach we are taking is mitigating legal risk and addressing some of the legal issues. I also think it's important to think win-win when you're working with vendors. Too often, people in my position will have an adversarial relationship with vendors. Their product's not accessible, they're not doing enough, so it immediately becomes confrontational. What I prefer to do, and I have found most vendors in the DLE space fall into this category, is let's partner with vendors and work together to make their products more accessible. And then finally, I think it is really important to work with your accessibility resources or disability services office. I have been fortunate in my career, both in the work that I did at the University of Buffalo and the work I've done over the last few years with SUNY administration, to have really good relationships with the people in the role of accessibility resources. And I think there is great value in having good coordination and collaboration between the work done by an accessibility officer and the work done by the folks in disability services. And with that, Lauren, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you. I got a little chatty as always, but okay. It is all yours.
All right, let's hope this works.
Yeah, I will be ready to back you up if it doesn't.
Okay, got it? Can you see?
You have it.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mark. So just shifting gears a little bit, when preparing for this presentation, we really discussed how we wanted to address the relationship between the function of the EIT officer or related work at the campus level with disability or accessibility services, and where these two could potentially intersect with their workflow. So EIT accessibility, as we know, offers many benefits for people with and without disabilities. So really leveraging the principles of usability and also universal design for learning. So they're taking on kind of this more proactive macro view to ensure access. You know, higher education disability service personnel, we're really charged by institutions with promoting accessible campus environments, working with students to identify accommodations that remove barriers to access, and ensuring that those accommodations are provided and effective. So really, as we know, depending on the structure of the disability office, as well as the staffing, a lot of staff time may be spent on these individual student accommodation requests, more at that micro level. So for example, we have one student taking a class who is experiencing a disability related barrier and therefore requires X accommodation to remove the barrier. It's more of that reactive approach. So really we're kind of thinking like, what is the best way for these two groups to work together towards similar goals? And so I wanted to share a case study on the next slide, a campus collaboration case study. So my previous position was at SUNY Purchase, and that was a campus of about 4,000 students. And we really came at digital accessibility in the LMS related to course materials a little differently, and that was through collaboration with the library. So how did we get there? Prior to disability services collaborating with the library itself and the Teaching Learning Technology Center, they did a Moodle accessibility audit to identify issues with our online winter and summer courses. And this was before COVID, probably in about 2016. They found many reoccurring problems in our courses. There were bad scans linking to inaccessible content when we had access to accessible content, or a lot of broken or inconsistent linking, among other accessibility concerns. So in 2018-19, the partnership with Disability Services and an associate librarian, Rebecca Oling, was established when Rebecca was named the director of digital accessibility. And Rebecca was really important in this. She had been championing accessibility efforts in the library for many, many years leading up to this, with really just limited resources and no staffing. This was also, for context, during a time around when SUNY adopted our EIT policy. And it was also when the OCR complaints against the inaccessible websites in higher education were being filed across the nation. So just a little context. But really, using this knowledge and data from our audit and working together, we came up with this proactive approach of how Rebecca in her new role could work with faculty on the accessibility of their courses. So I just wanted to share that a little bit about how that role in our workflow was established. So essentially, every semester, Disability Services worked closely with Rebecca to identify individual courses that students with digital accessibility needs had registered or enrolled in. And we would categorize these courses based on the level of faculty training or time needed to make the content accessible. Once the courses were identified, as a group effort, Disability Services and Rebecca as Digital Accessibility Director, we did outreach to the faculty and offered one-on-one training and to show them how to make their courses accessible. Although I know one-on-one training is not always feasible, what we found was at our campus and in our culture, because we were focusing on that one course, there was a lot more buy-in, and faculty were able to leave the meeting itself with possibly some documents that had been remediated or a specific action plan on how to edit their course after they learned the skills they needed to. So this is Rebecca, my fabulous colleague. I'm going to share the link to her profile so you can learn a bit more about her. But essentially, she takes a 5-prong approach, and I talked about how Disability Services identified courses. She also did outreach to faculty and still does for what they consider high-risk courses, so where over 75 students are enrolled. She does outreach to all faculty engaging in online or hybrid courses, uses Blackboard Ally, and does outreach to those with the lowest scores, and then also any courses that are referred to her. So the advantage of this collaboration with the library, you know, I understand campus culture and resources may vary, but we just found this to be an outstanding partnership. It felt just so much better engaging in this proactive approach where we could start working on faculty outreach as soon as students registered for classes. So if they registered in November for the spring classes, we could start in November and really get a head start. By doing so, that allowed us a lot of time to work on various skills, send videos out for captioning or audio descriptions, or contact publishers. The connection between the digital accessibility officer also being a librarian was just phenomenal. She has so much knowledge that our staff does not have expertise in. She's able to make the most of the electronic library collections. They have the ebooks, the films with captioning and audio descriptions, and then they could, if not, they could advocate with the vendors to get access to them. It was really important too that as a librarian, she was a faculty member, so she was an ally outside of our office in the faculty space. and had that knowledge in, curricular design that we may not. And then lastly, we were both on our campus accessibility committee. And so it was helpful that we were working together and we could really look at trends and different barriers we may be seeing through our work and bring it to the accessibility committee as a whole to really leverage our voices and address those barriers in the courses. And as of 2023, I just connected with her last week. Even more exciting is she's been collaborating with the disability office in a way to keep notes in their disability services data management system accommodate. So they'll have record of faculty outreach and any types of meetings to really maintain that piece about compliance and note-taking related to accessibility. So there are many ways to collaborate with our offices. We would love to hear other ways. I'm sure it varies based on culture, size, but other ways EIT workflow intersects on campuses. And now I'm going to pass it back to Mark to lead question and answer.
All right, thank you, Lauren, and thanks everyone. I did just answer a couple of the questions that were in the Q&A. But one of the things we were hoping to accomplish today is to kind of continue the discussion about trusted sources and whether people have thought about this idea. If your campus or your system is trying to do something related to a trusted source, and if there's any opportunity to have SUNY and CUNY, given our, our relationship, both, geographically and budgetarily and all those kinds of fun things, if there's an opportunity to kind of, partner or collaborate on this idea. So with that, I will open it up both to the chat and if anybody wants, just kind of looking for feedback on, again, whether you've tried to do this and is there an opportunity here? And as we're waiting for some response, one thing I do want to say is that, as I mentioned, I have been in conversations with the OCR and primarily ahead as well, talking about the need for doing these evaluations in a different way. One of the things that may work well is trying to be broad and encompass all of procurement within higher ed, narrowing this down to look specifically at the digital learning environment, looking at LMS tools and looking at the vendors who integrate their tools within an LMS. The reason why I think it might be easier is that it's a much more focused set of tools, and you have vendors who I think will be, for lack of a better word, more cooperative. One of the things I've talked to the OCR about is creating something similar to the good housekeeping seal of approval, where a vendor would go through a process where they would be vetted by experts, and if they passed whatever criteria was established, that they would be able to say, we have been reviewed by this group and we have this seal of approval. For those of you who have been doing accessibility as long as I have, going back to the 1990s, there was something called Bobby Approved. Raise your hand if you remember Bobby approving your website. It goes way, way back, but we're kind of looking at the same concept. One of the challenges has been, and I say this with all due respect to my legal friends, is that often university counsel gets very leery about doing this kind of work because they don't want either me individually or me as the accessibility officer at the University of Buffalo saying a product is accessible when it's not, or vice versa, saying it's not accessible and then having a vendor taking us to court because I said that. So I have had numerous conversations with my colleagues across the country and conversations with other groups of university, whether it's the Big Ten Academic Alliance, whether it is the Ivy Plus group, systems in Tennessee, systems in Texas, lots of conversations with California. How do we make this work? But we struggle sometimes against that legal piece. That being said, I think this is really important, and I think there are ways that we can do this that would make our legal friends more comfortable. So anyways, I am, anybody who wants to get involved with this, feel free to reach out. Again, open up the floor here if you want to be participating. Again, I see some people from CUNY saying that they might be interested in kind of continuing this conversation. I do think there is opportunity. I think the mistake I've made in terms of looking at this project is trying to be too big too fast, trying to make it all encompassing, where I think if we do it on a smaller scale, both in terms of the number of campuses participating and the set of tools we're looking at, and almost looking at it as a pilot project, I think it has a better chance to demonstrate the value and maybe demonstrate to our legal friends that we're really doing this in such a way that does not impose any kind of risk.
So, Mark, there are some other questions in the Q&A. So if you don't mind, I'm going to call them out.
Sure.
We'll see who it makes sense to answer them. And before I do that, I just want to say, I do, Carrie, thank you for raising your hand. I've got your email address and we'll reach out to you. So from Karen Fung, is this type of project taken in all CUNY SUNY schools for students, faculties? I'm not sure I totally understand the question, and I can't speak for CUNY, but for SUNY, this migration, this implementation of the digital learning environment is happening with every single SUNY campus. So we are working with all of them, and it is across the SUNY system. And I don't know if anybody from CUNY wants to address CUNY. Looks like Chris is typing a response there.
I may type something. I'm not sure we're at the point we can answer this yet.
Okay, got it. Okay. And then is SUNY and CUNY hiring ADA coordinators with these skills? Mark or Lauren, do you want to talk about this?
So there are some SUNY campuses who have full-time EIT officers. Again, it is a challenge on smaller campuses where resources are tight to hire somebody specifically for that function. That being said, every SUNY campus does have a designated EIT accessibility officer. One of our goals as a system is to provide the training to help bring the skills of the EIT accessibility officers, up to speed, where they might not, many of them don't have the background in terms of web and digital accessibility. So we hope through training to be able to build out some of those skill sets. That being said, we do have a person identified at every campus to serve in that role.
Thanks. And then Mark, there's a question on, can you comment on the influence of New York State OITS IT policy, accessibility of information communication technology, and upcoming New York State legislation reference to a Senate bill on our procurement approach?
All right, so I am looking up
I don't know if I know that.
Yeah, so I do. I just want to make sure I'm looking at the right policy. So two things to be aware of kind of on the legal front, both in the federal government and in the state of New York. And John, if I'm not addressing this the way that you want me to, please let me know, but let me just kind of give you my take on where we are in terms of law. So one of the problems with the ADA is that it was written pre-web, pre-internet. So it's been 30 years of court cases deciding how do you interpret the applicability of the ADA to the digital environment. We've gotten in a much better place over those 30 years, but there is legislation in the US federal government to update and codify those rules. In New York State, there was a law passed in December that made it a requirement for anybody doing business with New York State, any vendor providing online tools to New York State, that their products need to be accessible and they are liable if they are not accessible. I just learned of this about 3 weeks ago, and I have been in conversations with many of my legal friends about what does this mean for both public universities in New York State and what does it mean for private universities in New York State. On the private side of things, it actually doesn't mean anything because they don't have to follow that. But for public universities, it's still being decided about who's going to enforce this and how is it going to be enforced. Is the expectation that the state, at the state level, will enforce this, and do they have the expertise to do that kind of work? Is the expectation that that it will filter down to CUNY and CUNY would do this? So, I've started some conversations with, my legal friends about what this implies, what this means for us. For me, it is good news, though, that there actually is something on the books in New York State that says, you vendors, you need to do this right. So Kim.
Yeah, Mark, I'm going to interrupt you because our sign languagers have a hard stop at 4 and Chris is saying that we have to stop. So Chris, final word to you.
Yes, sadly, for accessibility reasons, we can't go beyond 4. And thank you to our presenters. This has been amazing, and I'm glad we've got some CUNY, SUNY interest in talking more, and I hope the attendees got something out of it. So yes, Mark, Lauren, Kim, we really appreciate you taking the time to present.
Thank you.
And everybody come on back to the conference tomorrow. There's some great stuff coming up, which I don't have time to go through, but thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.